Nostalgia is a very, very powerful thing, especially in the entertainment industry. But is it a good thing? From movies being remade or rebooted a dozen plus times to big budget blockbusters relying on properties that you knew as a child, you gotta kinda wonder if nostalgia is pushing originality out of entertainment. Which is exactly what we're gonna talk about this week here on YouTube and Spotify. Oh yeah, you can hear us on Spotify. Get over there and give us a like, follow, all that stuff. But now with that out of the way, let's dive into it. Hey there, everybody. Welcome into the Behind the Screen podcast. I'm John Aljets, and joining me once again this week is my good buddy, Esh.
Hello?
So this week we're talking about nostalgic things, and in addition to Esh, I'm also joined by everyone's favorite pitch guy, Ryan George. I got a chance to talk to him via Skype, so he'll be popping in every once in a while during the episode, so be looking for that. So this week we're talking about nostalgia, things that, use our memories as a child to get us into the movie theater or what have you. So obviously a good point to be starting off is by asking Esh, what is something like right now that you feel like very strongly nostalgic for?
Well, several cartoons, because I just get into cartoons in a big way, so I'm very happy that Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is back with periodical episodes lately.
I actually have not heard of that.
Oh, that's just the latest rendition of Turtles cartoons, and it's very different from previous incarnations, so since we're speaking nostalgia, people were not happy at first, let's just put it that way.
Well, I mean, I feel like that happens every time there's a new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles thing.
Oh, dude, name a cartoon at any point since the internet was invented, and it has destroyed society at least once. If you are to believe the internet. No, I'm really happy about that. The DuckTales cartoons, whenever that's on too. I grew up with the comics that the original DuckTales cartoon are loosely based on. The Carl Barks and Don Rosa comics that aren't as well known in the US, to my knowledge. To those that haven't heard me before, I'm Scandinavian. So, but they're really popular here.
I used to work at a comic book shop, and one of our biggest sellers were the old DuckTales comics.
Well, there you go. No, I mean like the old Carl Barks stuff from the 50s and such. And the new show draws way more from the comics than the original one did. It was much more of a American cartoonified version. That's not a bad thing. I love that show. But when I see that and I see some old Italian characters that have never been in American animation before, it's just, there we go.
I grew up watching the original DuckTales, so I haven't actually watched the new show, but I've always been tempted just because I do definitely have that nostalgia for the old show. I haven't really been all that nostalgic lately for like movies or TV.
Well, there also isn't much lately.
Well, that's true, but I have gotten back into watching Power Rangers as of late, but it's not like I'm going back. I haven't really gone back and rewatched like Mighty Morphin. I've been watching series that I didn't catch during the time where I stopped watching. So like I sat down and I binge watched Power Rangers RPM because everyone said that was the best season ever.
Right.
So I sat down and watched that and things of that nature.
Aren't you a little old for this, Tommy?
I may be old, but I can still pull it off.
But on top of that, I've been on like a video game nostalgia kick. After they announced the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2.
That's right.
I kind of went on a spree of playing through those games, and especially playing the Thug Pro, the mod for Tony Hawk's Underground 2 that adds in like all of the classic levels.
Many hours were wasted in my day playing Fireball and Horse. Absolutely.
Yeah, lots of those.
I mean, I was more thinking stuff that's current right now. I'm rewatching the original Biker Mice cartoon because they were like my Ninja Turtles even while Ninja Turtles were still a thing. I had the board game. I shudder to think of how many times I make my dad play that. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. And a lot of it is stuff I haven't seen because I only had like 4 or 5 VHS tapes and I don't think the whole show ever got dubbed. So it's really fun for me to see all this. So that's some nostalgia I'm into lately.
You're talking about like classic TV shows and stuff. I actually asked Ryan George this very same question, and he brought up quite a few like 90s shows that I feel like a lot of people are super nostalgic for. So this is what he had to say.
Probably.
I mean, I grew up in the 90s, so I guess I'm pretty nostalgic for that kind of stuff. Thinking about like TV shows from the 90s, especially like Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark? Anything from that magical time where like you'd watch stuff fully without being on your cell phone and stuff. That gets me right in the nostalgia feelings. Even like non-scary shows like Magic School Bus, Arthur, Recess. Yeah, just things from childhood really get me.
So yeah, like Magic School Bus is a big one. Did you have Magic School Bus in your country?
I think we did, but we didn't on like normal channels. All those PBS shows I only heard about as an adult.
Magic School Bus, Arthur, stuff like that.
Yeah,
those are all
I
things
have
that
watched
Ryan talked
Arthur,
about.
but I watched it as an adult because I was like, what is all the fuss about? I keep seeing memes about this stuff. I gotta see it. And I actually enjoyed it way more than I thought I would.
The internet went a little crazy about Arthur for a while there.
They did.
But, the Magic School Bus, we got that, rebooted series with Kate McKinnon.
Oh, right. That happened.
Well, I feel like the 90s were kind of a hotbed for things that people are nostalgic for these days, which might have something to do with the fact that, those of us who grew up in the 90s are now at the point where we're spending money.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And also that was a renaissance in terms of budget and quality for a lot of the stuff we watched.
Oh, yeah.
That was about the time where producers realized, hey, if we actually spend a little, we might see a return.
Yeah, kid shows were taken a lot more seriously. And I feel like that was sort of a byproduct of the 80s, because in the 80s you had stuff like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which became like cultural phenomenons. So suddenly people felt like they could spend money on kid shows.
This is completely besides the points we're going to be speaking about, but historically speaking, that kind of started with Gummy Bears.
Oh, yeah.
And DuckTales, actually, because that was when Disney was like, what if we actually treat this like a freaking product?
Yeah.
What if we actually make our cartoon as just make it as good as we can with what money we can set aside for it. Just actually give them a budget and hire actual writers and stuff like that.
McDuck Manor? As in Scrooge McDuck? The bajillionaire? You're finally gonna sell us.
Because for better or worse, everything before that was a toy commercial.
And trust me, there's going to be a lot of talk about Disney in this episode, because I feel like nostalgia and Disney go hand in hand. So there's going to be definitely a lot of talk about that. But I guess that perfectly segues into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is like, over the last, I would say probably 2 decades, nostalgia has kind of been largely ruling the blockbuster space.
Yes.
So, Ash, I just got to know, what nostalgic properties have managed to get their hooks into you and get you into the theater to check out, like, some, nostalgic movie or something?
Well, absolutely everything Spider-Man related.
Oh, yeah.
Because Spider-Man was, by and large, my first superhero. Like, the original Spider-Man animated series would have come out when I was, like, 4. Which would make it probably on Danish TV when I was 5, getting closer to 6. So it was right at that point I started to actually comprehend shows I was watching.
Yeah.
So it became the first cartoon I actually watched religiously. I remember having a children's audio book that was basically a Spider-Man episode with Dr. Octopus in it. I remember the cover. I can see the cover in front of me right now. So definitely that, because that was very much my first superhero, and then Batman, of course. But Spider-Man was the first one I watched regularly, and he's still my favorite today. And I know a lot of people like to talk trash about the Amazing Spider-Man film series, and they aren't that good, I'll agree. But the first one has Lizard as the villain, and Lizard is the villain of the first episode of the animated series. So he was my first supervillain. I can't say no to Lizard. So I'll always have a soft spot for Amazing Spider-Man 1. That reason alone.
We will definitely be talking about more about Spider-Man specifically a little bit later on when we're talking about like reboots versus remakes.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But I feel like the MCU in general, like just Marvel movies in general, really, even going beyond the MCU, for me, the X-Men cartoon was a little bit of a bigger deal for little baby John.
Oh, I'm sure.
So when the 2000s X-Men film came out, I remember being, even though like when the first X-Men film came out, I think I was like 10 or 11.
That sounds about right.
But even then, that was probably the first example of like nostalgia getting me to want to see something.
Yeah, that's probably it. That's the big one I can think of with Spider-Man in general.
Yeah, and then of course, as I said, like Spider-Man was also another one. Going to go see the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. Although, like, I would even throw out that I feel like the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy made me want to watch Spider-Man Homecoming in a way. So there's like nostalgia upon nostalgia upon nostalgia. You're getting like a nostalgia sandwich going on there.
Sure.
Another big one for me was, I mentioned how I've gotten back into watching Power Rangers as of late. So the 2017 Power Rangers film was one that, I went to opening day to watch that, and I think I wound up seeing it like multiple times in theaters. And I have the Blu-ray like literally within arm's reach of me. So that was definitely a big one. And I feel like Power Rangers just as a property lives or dies based on nostalgia.
Oh, it absolutely does.
Yeah.
There are some that do. In a sense, so does the Ninja Turtles. I mentioned them earlier. I'm a big fan of the Turtles, and the Bay movies that came out a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Not so much the first one, but the second one is a film version of the 87 cartoon.
Yeah, that's what
Straight up.
That's what I heard. But getting back to, you mentioned Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's actually funny because Power Rangers and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles have actually crossed over a couple of times. They crossed over on the actual show during In Space, because at that time there was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Next Mutation, I think was the series.
Yes.
And then the Boom Studios comics just recently, like I want to say like last year, did a Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles crossover that culminated in the Turtles morphing, which was an experience. Which, by the way, if you like Power Rangers and you haven't read the Boom Studios comics, I highly recommend to go check that out.
I hear good things.
It's great stuff. I believe that it was Ryan was actually saying that he brought up one that got its hooks into him a little bit. Was the Jumanji movies.
I mean, one that I went to watch just out of, it was like morbid curiosity, but it was Jumanji, because that was like my movie in the 90s. I watched that so many times. Like, I think I probably wore out the VHS tape. It's just like, I love that movie. And I just wanted to, I had to go see what they would do with it. I was almost angry that they were doing it, which I think a lot of people were. And I went in fully expecting to be like, look what they did to my boy. They massacred my boy. But no, I was actually very entertained. It's just like a completely different kind of movie. But I think they did, like, with the concept that they went with, I think they did a good job with it. And they had like little moments of honoring the original in the midst of all their CGI action and stuff. So yeah, that's one that, they got me. They got me to go to the theater. They got me to pay money, and but I actually ended up enjoying it. So yeah, that was one.
Oh right, I totally forgot because that was a big movie in the 90s. For those that don't know, somehow that was a big thing.
Yeah, the original Robin Williams Jumanji was definitely. It was huge, especially among people within our age group.
Yeah. I rewatched it like a couple of years ago, and it still holds up surprisingly well.
Yeah, it's
a very fun movie.
It's a fantastic movie. But
love it.
That being said, have you actually seen either of the new Jumanjis?
I haven't seen the remake, but I did watch the remake. I did see the one called Welcome to the Jungle. I didn't watch the sequel that came later, but I really liked the first one. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I heard. I actually have not watched either of them, but I did hear really good things. And from what I've heard, the first one of these new films is actually like technically a sequel, because they sort of like make reference to the 90s Jumanji.
They acknowledge Parrish's existence, and the Jumanji game itself takes a new form to go with the ages. Actually, speaking of nostalgia, because the original is a board game in the movie, right?
Yeah.
But in the movie, the new movie that takes place in the 2010s, it takes the shape of a retro video game console.
Which retro gaming?
More specifically, like Super Nintendo, something that is similar to it. so that's definitely another nostalgia hook, right? Remember this thing?
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, that's actually really good. But yeah, wow, I didn't even consider Jumanji for my list here. But yeah, that definitely was a reason to watch it, because the first one was great, and it's been long enough that it doesn't feel forced.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, like, now that we've spent a good amount of time talking about the things that make us nostalgic and that get us into the theater, You know, the thing that I just have to wonder is nostalgia actually something that we should celebrate as much as we do within the industry? You know, Ash, what do you think about just the rampant use of nostalgia baiting in the industry?
I don't think it's anywhere near as new as people like to think.
No.
I think it's just much more visible now because there's way more content than there ever has been before, and everyone is screaming at the top of their lungs to get our attention.
That's fair.
Because okay, so we have the Marvel movies. Those are nostalgic for those that liked superheroes all their life, or like the original superhero movie, not original superhero movies, the 2000s superhero movies that kind of like paved the way,
stuff like that.
Spider-Man, X-Men, to a certain extent, Fantastic Four, you know,
oh god,
so on and so forth. I said to a certain extent, by the way.
At least it's not as bad as Fan 4 Stick.
Let's not even touch that one with any kind of stick. No, but the thing is, people see all these as like, ugh, another remake, ugh, another reboot, or even nowadays, like, oh, another Stranger Things, where they like pick a decade and they try to pay homage to that.
Oh yeah, that is a perfect example of like nostalgia baiting without being directly tied into something.
Exactly, but my point is, when people complain about that, and they're like, why can't things be original, like Ghostbusters, or Indiana Jones, or Star Wars? It's like, all of those were specifically made to capture the feeling of things that were popular 40 years before.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, Star Wars was basically a, like, send-up of old, like, sci-fi serials that you would see.
It was like a Flash Gordon Buck Rogers remake in a way. Like...
Yeah.
And Indiana Jones, I believe, is specifically tailored to be reminiscent of the old adventure film serials you'd see
100%.
when you went to the movies.
But even then, those themselves managed to bring a certain level of originality into...
See, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying people see a name they already know, and they either go, okay, I want to watch that, because we all go for the familiar.
Yeah.
Or they go, nobody makes anything original anymore. Why has Hollywood died? And it's like, they've been doing this forever, man.
That's fair.
Look at the 90s. Take a second at what came out in the 90s. Oh, wait. Flintstones, Dennis the Menace, Mr. Magoo. An awful lot of 1950s and 1960s cartoon characters suddenly got live-action movies. Why do you think that is?
I always forgot that Flintstones was a thing that exists.
I prefer to forget it, but... No, but my point is that I see where people are coming from, but stop treating it like it's some new disease that's spreading. I think it's just... It's always been there, and of course we all want to see something new. But then when people make something new, nobody goes to watch it.
I definitely feel like, though, that you know, you bring up that point. That's a very good point. It's very true. But these days, we're seeing it a little bit more blatantly. Whereas before, it was like, oh, you know, like, you got your Star Wars that's reminiscent of Flash Gordon things. Whereas these days, we're getting like, oh, this is just straight up like a remake of a property, and it's like beat for beat exactly the same. And oftentimes...
No, I do get it.
And oftentimes, like, it winds up being something that you gotta wonder, like, who was asking for it? Like...
Oh, definitely with some of them.
Who asked for a Gem in the Holograms movie?
I do actually know one or two very big Gem fans.
Wow.
So.
You might know
I've never seen the show myself.
You might know the only two big Gem fans. Like, okay, like...
Well, they were popular enough to have a comic recently.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, the cartoon, fine, like, whatever, be fans of the cartoon, but the movie, yeesh. Nostalgia doesn't lead to good movies all too often.
Not automatically.
It can, like, obviously Marvel is a good example, but, like, Ryan brought up, you know, he mentioned the Goosebumps movies.
Right. I don't know if they get me enough that I haven't seen the new Goosebumps movie, you know, that's not... The Jack Black things. If I see an old clip from Goosebumps, I'll be like, oh wow, Goosebumps. But not enough for me to like binge Goosebumps or watch Goosebumps movies and stuff.
The Goosebumps films were not good. Like, just honorable. No. I watched the first one.
The first one was very entertaining, but that's not the same thing.
It was entertaining. I will give it that. But I feel like it was entertaining. It's entertaining on the merits of the fact that Jack Black is in it.
Yeah,
kinda. I will never not be entertained by Jack Black.
And the thing is, like, let's talk about nostalgia. Let's talk about nostalgia goggles for a second, guys. The Goosebumps books and the Goosebumps TV show were not that good.
Okay, you shut your mouth.
The TV show especially wasn't all that great. I have a couple of the books. I see why they were popular. They were great when you were a kid.
That's fair.
They don't hold up that well, especially not the show.
Yeah.
Especially not the show's child actors.
Yeah, it definitely has some issues. The books were good. Leave those alone.
Okay, fair.
Leave those alone.
But yeah, that's definitely a case of a producer somewhere saying, okay, they're like looking at the clock. Okay, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now it's nostalgically profitable.
Yeah.
Let's make it now. I definitely see where that's coming from, and that's a prime example of how it's done badly. It can be done well though when it's used to make a point.
Yeah. And like
Actually.
another form of, nostalgia baiting that we see a lot is remakes.
Yes.
Like be it actual just blatant remakes or sort of subtle remakes in the way that like The Force Awakens was a subtle remake of A New Hope. And
yeah, I suppose.
There's a lot that we could say about the sequel trilogy. But The Force Awakens was basically a remake of A New Hope, and people got angry.
Definitely.
People got angry about it. Then The Last Jedi tried to do something completely different, but people got angry that it wasn't close enough to the original trilogy. And then that caused us to get Rise of Skywalker, it's a bit of a dumpster fire.
You're afraid that you will never be as strong as Darth Vader.
That's where I get very tired of people very fast with this nostalgia debate. Like, okay, so let's say somebody actually does, as a passion project, recreate a franchise. Like, I've loved this my whole life, I want to work on it, and I want to give it my spin. You can't win.
Yeah.
You can never win, because if you do exactly the same thing, people complain about that. But if you do something a little different and you try to shake things up and you try to fix what you saw as an error, people immediately jump down your throat and say you ruined everyone's childhood forever. Like, there's no middle ground. At least there's not a middle ground that's actually vocal about being a middle ground.
Yeah, no, because most of the people who enjoy the middle ground are people who are just like, oh, that was fun, and then don't talk about it.
Not really. Like, I enjoy the middle ground. I like seeing new versions of characters I know. I like seeing what a new writer comes up with, because the reason these franchises, like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they don't survive for 40 years on nothing. There's something there. There's something to those characters in all their simplicity, in all their absurdity that appeals to people. But they do have to change with the times. And I would personally much rather live in a world where we get the occasional failed experiment, next mutation.
Yeah.
And the occasional masterpiece.
And that was something that I was talking with Ryan about the idea of remakes, and something that he brought up, I feel like really solidly touches upon that.
It depends like how much of a, I guess, remake it is. Like what comes to mind when you say remake is Disney, what they've been doing with their stuff. Like the Lion King, the Lion King CGI remake is, I hate that. Like, I hate that that's a thing, and I hate that it was so successful, because it doesn't add anything of value. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think if you sit anybody down and watch the 1995 Lion King, I don't think anyone finishes that movie and thinks, it was good, but I wish I could see more detail on Simba's hair. Like, that's not the reaction, and that wasn't missing from the experience, and that's the only added value that they offered us. Even like Aladdin, the new Aladdin I didn't like that either. I think that's like, it doesn't add much of value, but at least in that case, you have a couple of new jokes, and maybe you'll get a couple of laughs that Robin Williams didn't give you. Like, why are you trying to compete with that? Anyway, yeah, if they're not adding enough value in a remake, then I think that's it's a waste of everyone's time.
So yeah, the idea that remakes are at their best when they kind of bring something new to the table. I tend to agree with him there. When you've got a franchise that's trying to revitalize via a remake, bring something new to the table that changes stuff up. For me, the best example of a remake that I think did it right was the Evil Dead remake that came out in 2013.
That was
Fede Alvarez.
Well, it has its problems still, but yeah, I really like that one.
I stand that movie hard. Like,
it is good. It is good.
I'm a big Evil Dead fan. Have been basically my entire life. I remember watching Army of Darkness when I think I was like 5. Wow. That was a great parenting decision, Mom. What I like about it is that it leans a lot harder on the horror than the entire rest of that series does.
I saw it at a horror festival, so I got a lot of like old school fans that were very, very angry about no Bruce Campbell swinging a chainsaw around.
See,
and here's the thing:
was fine with it.
If it's a remake of the first movie is a horror movie first and foremost.
Oh, yeah.
It's goofy, but not because it's not trying to be scary.
No, it's the first film, the original Evil Dead, is funny in a like B movie way. It's funny in
but it's
a
also like
it's
genuinely
low budget.
actually scary in some in some parts.
That is yet another movie that I'm within arm's reach of the Blu-ray.
That's a movie where I think they did the right decision by going for the feel of the original movie more than remaking the movie. They went for what it did at the time, which was be relentless in a way that hadn't been seen before. At least not in that way.
Yeah.
So we're not talking like the old story of somebody doing a low-budget movie with pocket lint over the course of 4 years, like the original. No, we're talking about someone who's just like, all right, we're gonna go completely ape. We're gonna be as evil as we possibly can.
Yeah. Although to flip this discussion on its head a little bit, you could actually argue that the 2013 Evil Dead is not a remake, but a reboot.
Yeah, sort of.
Because
like it's the same idea.
Well, because so a little detail that not a lot of people might remember about the 2013 Evil Dead. There's a scene in the beginning where Mia is sitting on the hood of an old abandoned car, and it's Ash's car from the original Evil Dead. Like, it's the exact
stuff
same
like
model
that.
and stuff. And so people are like, "Oh, is this a remake or is it a reboot?" Because nothing about that movie necessarily says that those original 3 movies didn't happen.
I want to bring up another horror remake where I think the nostalgia actually works in his favor because they change what is nostalgic for. The It movies, the new It. Because, okay, we saw the TV movie when we were a lot younger, probably. It came out in like 90, I believe. And like the book, that's about a group of adults who face an evil from their childhood, which was in the 50s. So the remake comes out 27 years later, very appropriately if you've read the book. And it's suddenly the childhood chapters take place in the 80s. That's not just a decision based on the fact that time has passed. It's also a decision based on who is the audience now and what can we comment on in that era. And the movie's changed a lot, both from the book and the original TV movie. But also just like it uses the setting to comment on horrible things that happened but were just accepted as part of life. Because that's what it does. It like makes you look the other way when you're an adult. But my point is just like, it's still the same idea, but it's adjusted to the current audience. And some of the kids' fears have been changed drastically. Yeah. Because in the original book, some of those kids, like, they face their biggest fear. And one of them is just like, well, I think that happens in the remakes too. One of them is just the Wolfman and nothing else.
Yeah. He's scared of... It's either the Wolfman or the Mummy. I can't remember.
I think it's both, actually. But my point is, that doesn't really work anymore. We need a little more meat on the bone there. So a lot of the fears they face are a lot more societal. Yeah. There are a lot more things that kids actually might experience, but nobody listens to them because they're children. And I feel like the movies capture that way better by making some very interesting choices in how to change things.
It's getting pretty heavy.
I'm sorry.
But yeah,
am I getting too real?
But you know, you're hitting the nail on the head there in that, like, the remakes, the new It films changed things that were, you know, not necessarily, you know, the plots didn't hinge on these specific details. You know, the plot of the film doesn't hinge on it being set in the 50s. But
the story is about overcoming childish fears.
Yeah. But it brought something it brought something new to the table without just doing a beat for beat exact remake.
And that's definitely what I personally prefer.
I feel like the biggest failing in terms of a remake of all time has to be the Psycho remake in the 90s.
Oh, which is shot for shot except for one really gross scene.
Yeah, they literally they shot one new thing, like, basically.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it's shot for shot, like frame for frame remake of the original Psycho, and that movie has no point in existing. Like,
yeah, exactly.
There is no reason why you should ever watch that movie over the original, unless you just want to laugh at Vince Vaughn. That's about it. Like, and even then, like, his performance isn't bad enough to really warrant laughing at. So, you know, that movie just kind of
and also
just fails.
This is more as a creator myself in some ways, like I mostly make YouTube videos, but I do like to tell stories too. You have to remember, as an audience member, when someone gets their hand on a franchise or a movie and they get the chance to remake it, of course they want to add their own touch.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you?
I mean,
it's both literally their job to do so.
Again, one thing that we touched upon pretty briefly, and I want to kind of like segue our way into, is, you know, this discussion of remaking something versus rebooting something. Because, you know, you could pretty easily make the same sort of argument that you're making right now for like the SpiderMan films. You know, which I feel like the SpiderMan films are probably the biggest example of the remake versus reboot discussion.
Absolutely.
You know, because we've had 50 bajillion Spider-Man reboots in the last like 2 decades.
Yeah.
You know,
that's also a rights issue because they keep shifting hands, which is really annoying.
Well, I mean, but that wasn't necessarily the case with the Spider-Man trilogy to the Amazing Spider-Man, which actually, funnily enough, you mentioned that you liked the first Amazing Spider-Man, but
I have a soft spot for it. I didn't say I necessarily loved
fair.
it.
But Ryan actually, he made the point that the Amazing Spider-Man films, to him, he almost would have just preferred if they didn't exist.
It's like a meme at this point where it's just like every couple of years Spider-Man gets rebooted. I feel like, I mean, I wasn't a fan of the Amazing Spider-Man movies. I also didn't like Spider-Man 3. So there's a little stretch there where it felt like they didn't know what they were doing with Spider-Man. I was happy to see that they were remaking it, that they were like rebooting it once again after the Amazing Spider-Man, because maybe those movies weren't for me, but I really did not like those at all. I think in an ideal world, you would have removed those 2 Amazing Spider-Man movies and you just would have had Spider-Man 1, 2, 3, and then you would have let it sit for a little bit, and then you would have brought him back in the MCU.
I mean, they aren't good. I agree on that much.
They definitely, like, here's the thing that I'll say about the Amazing Spider-Man versus the other Spider-Man films. I feel like they, at least the first Amazing Spider-Man, captured the like personality of Peter Parker really well.
The personality of Peter when he's wearing the mask, I'd say, but yes.
Okay, fair. There's the scene where he's like taking out the guys who are like trying to steal a car. That is, I hold that up as the perfect example of like, that's a Spider-Man moment through and through. But
that went a little away from the remake reboot discussion.
But there is definitely something to be said about, you know, like a reboot. You know, I feel like the Spider-Man films are almost more remakes than reboots. Because
that depends on which one you're looking at.
Well, because to me, a remake is we're starting the story over,
right,
in a similar way. Whereas a reboot is we're going to start a new thing that doesn't necessarily contradict what came before. Like, a prime example of that, I feel, is Ghostbusters 2016.
Right.
Which I don't like that movie. I'm just going to get that out of the way right now.
Oh, it's not good. I don't like it either.
I just don't.
But not for the reasons people will accuse me of.
Yeah, a lot of people will jump down that. I'm just going to step back and just go, I don't think it's funny. But that movie doesn't necessarily at any point like really negate the originals. And I think at one point during that film's development, there was talk about it almost directly referencing the originals.
They were gonna, I believe, and then they decided against it.
Yeah. But I would almost more strongly argue that the new Ghostbusters that's coming out, that might be more of a reboot. Just because, I mean, you could argue that it's a sequel, but I feel like that's the key with reboot versus remake is if you can argue that a reboot is a sequel, it's a reboot.
Right.
But
yeah, I can kind of see where you're going with that.
But the idea of like, okay, we're going to like start something fresh, to me means reboot. Whereas if it's like we're going to, you know, just start over, that's a remake.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that does put Spider-Man in a tricky position because like Homecoming doesn't have that much in common with the other Spider-Man movies other than being a Spider-Man movie and being set in a high school.
Yeah, but it like is set in its own continuity.
It is.
So that's where I would be more apt to call Homecoming a remake.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Or
that's
a restart,
definitely,
I guess, because you're not necessarily making the same thing over again.
I mean, now we're purely speaking semantics at this point.
Yeah, we're talking about like the actual definition of the words. How do you feel about reboots versus remakes?
I think reboots are interesting because that's when you can get some new ideas in there, hopefully, you know?
Yeah.
Because that's usually somebody saying, okay, we have this property, how do we make it work in a different way now while still retaining its core? Mm-hmm. Whereas a remake, that tends to ring very classic too. People bought it once, why not buy it again?
Yeah.
At least that's what I hear in terms of like industry speech.
Yeah.
Because like there are some reboots that have come out recently, like the She-Ra reboot that I've been watching on Netflix. Like, that doesn't have an awful lot in common with the original, but it still has a lot of the same charms in a way. Mm-hmm. And it certainly still leans on what came before it, but it tells something new to a new audience that has new interests. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think reboots tend to be more interesting, if not necessarily better.
That's fair.
Because that's usually where someone is like, all right, what's my version of this?
Yeah.
More than a remake is.
So, now we've been talking about, like, the obvious downsides of nostalgia baiting. I feel like we would be remiss to not bring up the idea of these properties that are connected to pre-existing franchises or IPs or something in some way, be it a remake or reboot or whatever. The idea of them taking up so much space that they're basically pushing new and original ideas to the sidelines.
Yeah.
And that's some real stuff. Like, when was the last time that you went? Okay. Right now, this question is a whole different thing. But when was the last time that I was going to say went to a theater to see something, but when was the last time that you went out of your way to watch something that was a wholly brand new idea?
Well, that depends on if it's based on a book, which most of the movies everybody loves is, by the way.
I'm gonna count that as being a pre-existing thing. So
okay, well then I just have to bring up the list of movies I've watched this year in general, because obviously not a lot has been released that I've had a chance to see.
Obviously,
because like, okay, I could say Color Out of Space, but that's a film version of a H.P. Lovecraft story, you know.
Here's the thing: I feel like there are certain things where it's like it's so old that calling it a nostalgic thing is not really correct. So like things that are based off of like H.P. Lovecraft, there might be some people who are, but that's so old. Or like, for instance, I would argue that the Invisible Man movie that came out early this year is an original thing, because it's just so like, it has nothing to do with the H.G. Wells Invisible Man.
Right.
Like, other than just a dude used science to turn himself invisible. Like, that's all it has. And it has nothing to do with the original film. Yeah.
Hollow Man didn't either.
So like that, I would argue is probably an original idea. Color Out of Space, I would argue is an original.
In that case, that's the most recent one, as it came out recently, somewhat recently.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I also go to film festivals. I frequent a horror film festival. I frequent Copenhagen Pix when I can.
Maybe we aren't necessarily.
I do go out of my way.
We're cinephiles, so maybe it's not.
We are.
Maybe asking us this question is a little bit loaded.
But that is actually something that is actually a point I want to make. Okay, yes, it's true. The big blockbusters are almost always derivative of something, or they're supposed to call back to something. Even Ready Player One, which is a new story, was seeped in nostalgia for everything from the 70s to the 90s.
We could have this whole podcast could have just been Ready Player One. Boom, there's your.
It kind of could, but it does make some of the points we've also made. Like, don't hinge your entire identity on this. Experience something new now and then too.
Yeah,
like that's part of the point. But okay, yeah. The blockbuster scene is definitely saturated with that. And again, like I said earlier, it's also because there's just so much more of it, and they're all screaming louder than they ever have before. Mm-hmm. We no longer live in a world where we all had 5 movie studios and 3 TV channels.
Yeah,
but that also puts some of the responsibility on the viewer's shoulders. Not every movie out there is a blockbuster. Not every movie out there is gonna get the same commercial attention. So you have to take part in finding the content you want to see. And of course, I would love it if more original stuff made it to big time theaters. But that's just not how it goes right now. It's still a business. They gotta make money.
And it's also, you gotta realize that, again, we are not atypical of your common moviegoer, because we do go and see, for the most part, I see every movie that comes out. Like,
I try.
whether I want to or not. For the most part, I see it. Whereas most people, you know, I think if I remember correctly, I was reading the statistic and it was like the average person goes to see, like, I think it was between 3 and 5 movies a year.
Yeah.
You know, like, so for your average moviegoer, they want to, like, they're going to make the safe choices to go see a movie. You know, if someone's only going to go see 3 movies in a year, they're going to go see 3 Marvel movies. They aren't going to go see, you know, Midsummer or The Lighthouse.
Yeah, probably not.
You know, even though, like, those two, you know, especially Lighthouse, God, that movie was so good.
Or they're going to be the, I'm stereotyping here, but the older generation who watches all the Oscar bait movies, you know. But that's a normal human condition. Human beings always seek out the familiar.
Yeah,
that's just a thing we do to survive.
But and
that translates to our taste in media.
Yeah. Do you think that, you know, because so many people do argue that originality is dead. You know, you can only hear so many people say, "Oh, we need to stop seeing superhero movies," but you know, does that really mean that, like, hey, if you're saying that, maybe go watch, you know, the next A24 film that comes out?
If that's your statement and if that's the message you want to send, then you gotta put your money where your mouth is. You have to be willing to take a chance. And maybe it's a little sacrifice for you. Like, okay, maybe you waste, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because I don't think any movie is a waste, technically. Maybe you waste 2 hours and some dollars.
Yeah.
But you've still made some kind of statement with it. I think people are forgetting that it's also their responsibility to choose what they watch, to choose what they read, to choose what they experience. Sure, you might have to spend an hour scrolling through Netflix, but isn't it worth it when you find that one movie you can tell everyone about next time you see them?
Yeah. It's kind of like
that nobody else has seen.
You know, going back to something that Ryan said, talking about the Disney movies. Like, Disney these days, we're seeing, you know, they're just blatantly remaking their animated films as live action movies.
That's a prime example of awful nostalgia base.
Well, like I have actually been sort of, I wouldn't say like actively, but I've been personally boycotting those remakes. I haven't gone and seen any of them in theaters. Just because, like, I personally do not support that, because they aren't really bringing anything new to the table. I think Aladdin had like a new song or whatever, but
I mean, I'm sure some of them are fine in some ways. I'm sure some of them aren't as terrible as we might think they are. But also, they exist for literally only one reason. They exist to trick parents into dragging their children in to see something they've already seen. I mean, I find that to be a downright insulting industry they've got going right now.
Yeah,
with that.
That's also, again, why I don't really.
Disney is a lot more interesting on TV than in theaters right at this moment.
I mean, you're not wrong. And so, I guess the thing that I really wanna ask, you know, we're both people, you know, we want to make movies ultimately, and I feel like everybody who loves movies at some point wants to. So I want to ask, like, if you were given the opportunity and you were told, like, hey, you can only make one movie and it has to be either a wholly original thing or it can be in whatever, like, universe you love that's pre-existing, which would you choose to go with?
I mean, there are very strong arguments for both, honestly.
Yeah.
The morally uptight choice would be wholly original.
Yeah.
That would be the one where I can pat myself on the back and say, there you go, buddy, you saved all of Hollywood. But there are also franchises that never actually got that much attention that I would love to get the opportunity to put into a movie.
Yeah.
And expose to more people, you know?
And, you know, Ryan, this is what Ryan had to say about it, by the way.
I would say ideally something original. As crazy as it must be to be, you know, like J.J. Abrams and be given the keys to your favorite franchises and get to play around in those worlds. If I was given the chance to make a movie, I would want to just like get weird with it. And yeah.
Ryan brought up a good point in that, like, yeah, you know, if you're doing an original thing, you get to kind of like build your own universe and sort of, you know, make your own sort of way with things. And that is, I feel like, as close to a right answer as you can get would be choosing original. But the thing that I'm curious about is then what pre-existing IP would you go with? And Ryan said,
I guess I'd go with with the MCU, just because there's a ton of humor in there. And so I feel like that would be a good place for something weird and funny. Of course, you'd have to deal with whatever goes on behind the scenes of like incorporating other characters and making it all connected. But, you know, if the Russo brothers, who come from a comedy background, can do like these action epics that have a ton of jokes in them, then that feels like a good place where I would have a lot of fun.
Which he has good reasons for wanting to be in the MCU. I think being someone who's a comedian wanting to work in a comedic universe makes sense. But which one would you go with?
I mean, for anyone who actually knows me from YouTube, I'm going to be extremely predictable, because I would absolutely love to get a chance to produce an Usagi Yojimbo movie.
I was waiting for you to bring up.
I know.
That property. Like, I've literally been sitting here, I was like, he has to mention it at some point.
Yeah. But for those that don't know, it's a long-running comic book franchise that has existed since 1984, crossed over with Ninja Turtles several times, and it's still owned by the same creator. Supposedly there's an animated series on the way, but, you know, with the world being what it is, everything is kind of up in the air with that. I would love to give that a fully animated motion picture, you know, like a feature film. But that's definitely one that I would love. And of course, like, if we go for some more safe answers, if I got to make a Spider-Man movie or a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, I would love that, because I want to do some things that they haven't done yet.
Yeah.
Turtles in particular tends to play it very safe. It's almost always, Raph and Leo are mad at each other, and then the Shredder shows up. Like, that's it every time. And I'm like, why not give Mikey or Donatello the spotlight in a movie for once?
Well, it's kind of like...
And introduce a different villain. I would use the Rat King, personally.
Yeah, it's kind of like...
Because I think he's really interesting.
I wouldn't necessarily make a Power Rangers project, but I would love to get away from the formula of... A bad guy's introduced, they fight him on foot in the suits for a little bit, and then it gets big and they fight it in a Megazord. I would love to get rid of that formula, because personally, I don't like the Megazord segments at all. I just don't care.
I've never been a giant robot guy myself, so I definitely see where you're coming from.
But I'd probably want to work in something horror related. Personally,
oh yeah, absolutely,
like
too.
if I would
love to make a Friday the 13th movie. Personally.
If I got the opportunity to do like an Evil Dead, that would be pretty awesome. But I would also like to get the opportunity to make a good Green Lantern movie.
Well, wouldn't that be lovely?
Well, because Green Lantern is my favorite superhero, and it physically pains me whenever I remember that the only time he's been on the big screen has sucked.
Quick nerd question.
Yes.
Which lantern would you make your movie about? Because there's been like 5.
I mean,
would it be Hal? I
feel like the easy choice would be to do Hal. If somebody was like, "Hey, John, make a Green Lantern movie," I would probably do Hal's days training with Sinestro.
Ooh. I'm sorry, I just couldn't help asking. So.
Like my favorite Green Lantern personally is Guy Gardner.
He rocks.
So I would love to see him up on the screen, but it doesn't make a ton of sense to go straight into Guy Gardner. They've talked about doing a Green Lantern Corps film that is focused on Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart, which I think is a good combination of those two.
Oh yeah.
Ain't nobody mentioning Kyle Rayner.
I like him. I don't know
or Simon Baz or Jessica Cruz. There's so many Green Lanterns now that I think about it.
We're just talking about the human ones.
Yeah.
No, but that actually, we should probably round this up fairly soon.
Yeah.
But that's actually what I've been saying this whole time. Like, listen to us nerd out about the franchises we would love to make a movie about. That's because we're us. That's because we have our relationship with that franchise. That's because we want to add our touch to something pre-existing.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a bad thing, but it does get abused.
I think that's the main thing to walk away from, is that, like, it's not necessarily that nostalgia is a bad thing. It's that it is used far too often as an excuse to crank out basically stuff that we've seen already.
And again, more original stuff is being made, but it's on a much lower scale, and you have to look for it. I think people need to realize that and actually be willing to put in the work. But yes, it would be nice if it wasn't quite like that.
Yeah. Anyways, with all that being said, there's really only one thing left to do, and that is just simply, Ash, where can people find you on the internet?
Well, we've already mentioned it a couple times, but you can find me on YouTube, where I run a channel called Fiction Addiction. I'm also on Twitter, where you can find me at ESH_FicAddict. because again, it's called Fiction Addiction, so it has to be in there. And the same ad leads to my Instagram, where you can see my drawings. I do a lot of fan art drawing.
Yeah. My other guest, Ryan George, you can find him on Twitter. He is at the Ryan George. And of course, you can check him out on Screen Rant. He's the guy who hosts the pitch meetings, so obviously you've probably seen it at least once. And in addition to all that, you can find me on YouTube under Bender Waffles, BenderWaffles, where I teach game development. You can also find me on all the social medias under the exact same name. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. But anyways, guys, I hope that you had a wonderful time listening to the podcast. Be sure to check us out on Spotify. Yeah, we're available on YouTube and Spotify, so check us out over there. And hope you have a wonderful time. Esh, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, always a good time.
No, don't touch that. Whoa.
Well, guys, what do you think about nostalgia? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or is it, okay, but just kind of used a little too much? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below, and while you're down there, why not consider subscribing to Screen Rant, or if you're on Spotify, like us, follow us, all that sort of stuff. Thanks for listening, and stay safe out there.